This is going to be a tough story to tell. Not because it's the worst that I've ever told, but because the amount of injustice that occurred to the black man I'm going to talk about is tremendous. They didn't just use brutality and violence on him. They mobilized and used the entire weight of the government against this one black man to prosecute him for something that everyone knew that he didn't do. This story highlights something that I'm always talking about, and that is how the rule of law completely abandoned black people in the South. And the only reason it happened to us was because we were black. Not because we had done anything to deserve it, but because of the color of our skin. This story is just one of thousands where a black person faced tremendous terror and brutality simply for being black. Before I get into the story, let me give you some historical context first. This history is important to fully appreciate and understand what happened to the black man I'm going to talk about in this video. So give me a few moments to talk about this, and then I'll get into the story and what happened to him. The fight against forced confessions existed long before the world heard about what John Burge did in Chicago and what happened to the Central Park Five in New York. This problem goes back more than 100 years, and the fight against forced confessions and the police torture of black people started in the 1930s and the 1940s. Police brutality against black people has long been a cornerstone of white rule in the South. Following the end of slavery and the failure of Reconstruction, it became a vital mechanism for white Southerners to reinforce dominance and to maintain the evolving system of racial segregation well into the 20th century. Southern police officers believed that physical violence and brutality was necessary to keep black people in line and that they were the upholders of the caste order in the South. The torture of black prisoners and defendants was a crucial tool for preserving the segregated order in the South. Policing in the South was left to the same group of people who were once overseers on the plantations that black people were enslaved on. Police officers were often recruited from the lower rungs of the white community. Some police forces in the South didn't even have educational requirements, and many of the officers and sheriffs were uneducated. In fact, in 1939, only 6 of the 26 members of the Athens, Georgia Police Department had even graduated from high school. Being uneducated was not an impediment to a white person wanting to have a good job as a police officer or sheriff. This allowed police forces to be all white. In the late 1930s, there wasn't a single black police officer in Mississippi or South Carolina or Louisiana or Georgia, in Alabama and Arkansas and Virginia. And this is the primary reason why there was so much racial violence being perpetuated upon black people by Southern police forces. What happened on the plantation was just upgraded to the police station. By the mid-1930s, the issue of police brutality and torture against black people in the South began to get national attention, and one of the reasons for this was the NAACP's campaign against the use of forced confessions to convict and execute black people in Southern courts. In the 1930s, under the leadership of Charles Hamilton Houston and his successor Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP began to use the courts to challenge legal racism and segregation in the South. The use of coerced confessions was one of the first battles waged in the courts. All across the South, black people were being subjected to unspeakable violence at the hands of lynch mobs and also at the hands of the police. This combination of mob and legal lynchings put the rule of law out of reach for black people. The law did not protect black people outside the courthouse, nor inside the courthouse. I've talked about one of the cases that the NAACP took on that involved forced confessions. It was the case of Arthur Ellington, Henry Shields, and Ed Brown, 3 black men in Mississippi who were beaten and had mock lynchings performed on them just to get them to confess to a crime that they did not commit. But in this video, I want to talk about another case that is just as horrific and if not more. The case of William Douglas Lyons. On December 31st, 1939, someone broke into the home of Elmer and Marie Rogers. They were poor white sharecroppers with 3 young children. Elmer was fired at immediately and taken out. When Marie tried to run with the children to the front door, she was fired at. Their home was burned to the ground. In the end, Elmer and Marie were dead, and so was their 4-year-old son, Elvie. Their 7-year-old son, James, managed to survive and save himself and his 1-year-old brother. News of what happened spread quickly and sent the small community into an uproar. The police began to investigate. 2 days later, a tip led authorities to arrest Frank Wellman, a prisoner who was already incarcerated for a fatal crime. Wellman had special privileges at the prison as a trustee. Because of this, supervision was not tight. Many inmate trustees were allowed to leave the prison at night to gamble and to go hunting. By January 9th, another man named Houston Lampert, he had also been arrested and confessed to being at the Rogers home when the crime was committed. A 72-year-old white woman had tipped the police off. She said that Lampert had come to her home that night of the crime with his hair burned and his shirt bloody. The Hugo Daily News ran a headline after the arrest saying that the police had solved the crime. That should have been the end of the case, but it wasn't. There was still public outcry over what happened. People were upset that convicts could be allowed to leave so freely and put the public in danger. This was a huge problem for Governor Leon Phillips. He was up for re-election that year, and he needed this to go away. Governor Phillips and others decided that someone else needed to be held responsible for this crime. By doing this, he would avoid the issue of his administration's failure to secure the prison and the public around it. Governor Phillips sent investigator Vernon Cheatwood to clean up the mess that this had caused. When Cheatwood got to Hugo, he ordered that the two white men that had been arrested and had already confessed to the crime, he ordered that they be released. He told them that they had to leave the state and go to Texas. Cheatwood and the state of Oklahoma even made arrangements for these two white men to leave. The governor's office then announced that the search for the real culprits would begin. Days later, Cheatwood and local police arrested 21-year-old William Douglas Lyons, also known as WD, a local black sharecropper. WD had admitted that he had been hunting rabbits near the Rogers home, but he said he had nothing to do with this crime. But it didn't matter what WD said, because as far as Cheatwood and the police were concerned, they had someone they could pin this crime on. Over the next 2 days, Cheatwood and the police beat WD over and over again. And when they were not beating WD, they were denying him food. The beating was brutal. WD was punched and he was kicked, and his head was rammed into the wall. His eyes were blackened. His mouth was busted open. Cheatwood beat WD on the back of the head with a blackjack, and then they make WD sit down in a chair and they beat his legs and beat his arms. But that was not even the worst part. When WD did not confess to the crime after being beaten by Cheatwood, that's when Cheatwood and the police came up with a new plan. Shortly after midnight, Cheatwood walked into the cell where WD was, pulled out a large black pan filled with charred bones of the victims. Cheatwood then threw the pan into WD's lap. WD tried to get away, but he couldn't. Cheatwood then pushed WD's face into the pan of bones. When WD still wouldn't confess, Cheatwood took the bones and he put them in WD's hands, and he made WD hold the teeth while they beat WD. Finally, WD couldn't take it anymore, and he confessed to the crime, just to get them to stop. But that wasn't enough for Cheatwood and the police. They then took WD to a nearby state penitentiary and showed WD the electric chair. They then made him confess in the presence of the district attorney and a stenographer. But that wasn't it. In the second confession, they made WD swear that he had not been beaten at all. The governor and Cheatwood were satisfied, and they told everyone that they had someone in custody and they had caught the real attacker and that he had confessed. The same paper that said that the white man confessed ran a story saying that a black man had now confessed to the crime. It offered no explanation for the change at all. Local black residents were outraged at what happened and sprung into action. Roscoe Dungy, he was the editor of a small black newspaper in Oklahoma called The Black Dispatch. He was the son of formerly enslaved black people, and he was committed to helping his people. He used his own money to hire an attorney for WD from Oklahoma named Stanley Belden. But that was not all that Dungy did. He was also a member of the NAACP's national board. He wrote to NAACP leader Walter White and told him that he wanted Thurgood Marshall to personally come to Oklahoma to help represent WD at his trial. Thurgood Marshall agreed to come. Now, this was significant because the NAACP had only come into a case after a person had been convicted. They would then help appeal the case, sometimes all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. But with WD's case, Thurgood Marshall was coming himself to try the case. Thurgood Marshall was only 31 years old at the time and only 7 years out of law school when he agreed to represent WD. He arrived in Oklahoma on January 26, 1941. Black people feared that he'd be harmed, so they immediately pushed him into the back of a car as soon as he got off the bus and hid him away. They feared that the governor and Cheatwood would harm Marshall to continue their cover-up. The trial started a few days after Marshall arrived in Hugo. Judge J.R. Childress presided over the trial. The prosecution called 15 witnesses, including WD. Prosecutor Norman Horton, he tried to get WD to say that he was not beaten. WD accused the prosecutor of being present when the police beat him. Horton got so angry, he admitted that he was there, but he said that he tried to stop the beating. WD told the court that he was beaten severely. Before I finish this story, I want you to hear WD's words when he described how he was tortured. Hear what was done to him. We were able to find the actual transcript from his trial in 1941. So I don't want to just summarize the story for you. I want you to hear it exactly as it was said over 80 years ago.
Mr. Cheatwood handcuffed me in a chair, like this. Handcuffed me in a chair, and the county attorney was sitting on the left side of me, and Mr. Cheatwood was standing in front of me, and Mr. Reza Kane was behind me. And they told me, Mr. Cheatwood called me a black son of and threatened to stick red-hot irons to me to make me confess to a crime. And Mr. Cheatwood was saying, "Didn't you commit the crime?" I told him no. Mr. Cheatwood was yelling, "Why don't you answer the prosecutor's question?" Then he was beating on me all that time. Beat me with the blackjack. He was sitting in front of me, whipping me on the legs and knees and hands and shoulders and arms. It was a flat one, loaded with some kind of shot because every time he hit me, it rattled inside. It was shaped like a milk bottle. And then they taken me up several times on a table like this, taking me across it and whipped me on my back. One would beat me for an hour and a half or two, and then he'd get tired, and the other would take me and beat me that way all night. Razor Cane was behind me. He beat me with his fist behind my head. Then he would pull my hair. Then he would shake my head and hit me with his fist every once in a while. And Mr. Cheekwood, he was hit me and beat me in the front, on the knees and legs and arms and shoulders with the blackjack. They beat me, and kept yelling questions at me. They was yelling, saying, "You answer the prosecutor's questions." I told them I didn't know anything to answer. He told me I would answer it before 48 hours from that. They beat me just like that, over and over all night. Beat me and beat me until I couldn't stand no more, till I gave in to them and answered the questions that they demanded. Then they brought me back to that same little room by the sheriff's office and kept me there a while until they ate breakfast. Then they was going to take me out to take me to the scene of the crime. They brought a pan full of bones that they said come from those bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Rogers. They set them up on my lap.
Thurgood Marshall questioned Vernon Cheekwood. He got Cheekwood to admit that he put the pan of bones in WD's lap. Cheekwood said that he thought that it would refresh WD's memory.
Did you set a pan of bones on his lap?
Yes.
Why?
That was for the purpose of refreshing his memory of that gruesome crime that had been committed.
What did you expect to get from that?
With my experience, I wanted to bring him back into the crime and refresh his memory of the whole situation. And I did that.
What did you expect to get from that?
That I would find out one way or another whether he had done this crime or whether he had not.
Marshall also questioned Cheekwood about how he beat WD. Cheekwood denied it. Marshall then called to the stand a white hotel clerk. The clerk testified that Cheekwood came to the hotel the day after WD confessed and said that Cheekwood told him to go upstairs and get his beater. He used a racial slur before using the word beater that I can't say and really I won't say here. He then proceeded to show everyone in the lobby what he used to beat WD with for 7 hours to make him confess. During the trial, Thurgood Marshall did something that was both dangerous and also strategic. He cross-examined all of the police officers. You have to remember, during this time, the presence of a black lawyer defending a black man was seen as an affront to white rule and the racial order of the day. And black people had been lynched for small things that white people had perceived as offending their status in the racial order. So Thurgood Marshall used this to his advantage. Cross-examination is the part of a trial where an attorney gets to question a witness that is not favorable to the client or the client's case. It's when things can get really heated in the courtroom. Thurgood cross-examined the police officer because he knew that all of the police officers would get angry at being questioned by a black man, and that's exactly what happened. Every single police officer got angry when questioned by Thurgood Marshall about their lies and about their brutality and their torture of WD. But this was also more than just to call the officers out on their lies. It also broke through the racial order of the day. By calling the officers liars and speaking to them harshly, it overturned the long-held notion that white people are more credible than black people and that black people should be passive when in the presence of white people. Black people in the courtroom took notice of what Thurgood Marshall did. Despite all the evidence that proved that WD had been beaten into confessing, the judge denied Marshall's request to throw out both confessions. The judge said that there was evidence that WD had been beaten to confess the first time, but that the second confession had been voluntarily made because there was no evidence that WD had been beaten prior to when he confessed the second time. WD was found guilty by the all-white jury and sentenced to life in prison, but his sentence was proof that the jury did not believe that WD had committed this crime, because the jury could have given WD the death sentence, and they decided not to. The battle was not over for WD, though. In fact, it was just beginning. Thurgood Marshall filed a motion for a new trial. When the judge denied that motion, Marshall and the NAACP, they appealed WD's conviction. The NAACP used WD's case to draw national attention to the plight of black people in Southern courts and what Southern justice looked like. In March of 1941, the NAACP published a full-page article in its monthly magazine, The Crisis, about WD's case. Despite the national attention that the case got and the outrage in the black community about WD's case, in June of 1943, the Oklahoma Supreme Court denied the appeal and upheld WD's conviction. The NAACP continued to fight, though. They appealed WD's case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. This brought hope that WD's conviction would finally be overturned. On June 5, 1944, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld WD's life sentence. The court said that the amount of time between the beating and the second confession made the second confession admissible in court. WD spent the next 20 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit. He was paroled in 1961, and in 1965, he was pardoned by the governor of Oklahoma. After that, he disappeared from public life. He died in 1996 at the age of 75. What W.D. Lyons went through was worse than the most horrific nightmare you could ever have, because you can wake up from a nightmare and move on with your life. W.D. carried what he went through to the grave. His story represents what it has and still means to be black in this country. I want to know your thoughts on this story. Had you ever heard of W.D. Lyons, and how did it make you feel learning all that he went through? Leave me a comment down below and let me know your thoughts.